the day Reuben Whitaker told the circuit judge to take his ruling and ride it straight back to whatever city he had crawled out of. Every soul in Caldwell County, Kansas, decided the man was either the bravest fool alive or simply the most stubborn creature God had ever fashioned out of prairie dust and sheer iron will. It was the spring of 1878, and the plains of southern Kansas were still raw and wind-scoured, the kind of land that did not suffer weakness gladly. The town of Millard Creek sat at the edge of a long, flat stretch of buffalo grass, its main street lined with false-fronted buildings that advertised more permanence than they actually possessed. The cattle drive still pushed north through this corridor, and the town swelled and contracted with the seasons like something breathing. In the summer months, it smelled of cattle and dust and wood smoke and ambition. In the winter, it smelled of nothing but cold. Reuben Whitaker had ranched the same 400 acres southeast of Millard Creek for 11 years. He had arrived at the age of 22 with a horse, a rifle, a bedroll, and a deed of homestead that he had earned by doing nothing more remarkable than surviving his first winter on the open range. Now he was 33, broad through the shoulders, weathered in the face, with dark eyes that missed very little and a mouth that said exactly what those eyes observed without any particular concern for how the observation might land. He was not a cruel man. He was not even an unkind one. He simply had a relationship with the truth that most people found uncomfortable, and he had no interest in altering that relationship for the sake of social harmony. His cattle were some of the finest in the county. His fences were tight, his well never ran dry. And his reputation for stubbornness had become so thoroughly embedded in the fabric of local life that it functioned less as a judgment and more as a weather condition. People planned around Reuben Whitaker the way they planned around a blizzard. They did not argue with him. They did not try to persuade him. They simply acknowledged the direction he was moving and got out of the way. 3 times the town council had asked him to join their number. 3 times he had declined, not rudely, but with a finality that made a 4th invitation seem absurd. 2 widows, a schoolteacher from Ohio, and the daughter of the Millard Creek banker had each, at various points, entertained what they privately considered serious romantic prospects where Reuben Whitaker was concerned. Each had discovered within a few weeks that while the man was not without warmth, he had an absolute allergy to being managed. The moment any of them attempted to suggest he might benefit from softening his speech, or attending church more regularly, or perhaps wearing his good shirt to supper instead of the everyday one, something in Reuben's eyes went quiet and flat, the way a river goes quiet before it changes course entirely. He was not mean about it. He would simply say something like, "I appreciate your concern," in a tone that communicated the exact opposite of appreciation, and that would be the end of it. The citizens of Millard Creek had long ago arrived at a collective understanding. Reuben Whitaker was what he was. He would die what he was. The land would have him back eventually, and it would get back exactly what it had loaned out. Then Jennie Leland arrived on the afternoon stage from Wichita. She came in on a Tuesday, which was not a remarkable day in Millard Creek by any standard. The stage from Wichita ran on Tuesdays and Fridays, and it usually brought mail, occasionally brought a drummer selling patent medicines, and every few months brought someone new to the territory. The people who gathered around the stage depot were doing so out of habit more than expectation. Jennie stepped down from the coach with a traveling bag in one hand and a hat that the wind immediately tried to steal. She caught it with practiced ease, pinning it back with a single sure motion, and looked around the main street of Millard Creek with the expression of someone taking careful inventory. She was 26 years old, which she had arrived at through what she privately considered a moderately harrowing education in the realities of the world. She was of medium height, with dark auburn hair that showed copper in the afternoon light, and green eyes that had a quality of calm assessment that some people found reassuring and others found quietly unnerving. She had grown up in Missouri, moved to Wichita with her father 3 years before his death from fever, and had then spent 8 months working as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant who had eventually sold his business and moved his family to Colorado, at which point Jennie had found herself in possession of a modest sum of savings, a clear head, and no particular reason to stay in Wichita. She had come to Millard Creek because she had heard from a woman at the Wichita post office, whose cousin's husband lived in the county, that there was a position available for a woman who could keep accounts and was not afraid of hard work. The position was at the general store run by a man named Harold Fenwick, who was an honest merchant with honest prices and the organizational abilities of a field mouse. His books were a disaster. He needed help. Jennie had written a letter. Harold Fenwick had written back, and here she was, standing in the afternoon sun of a Tuesday in April, watching a town assess her while she assessed it right back. Miss Leland. Harold Fenwick himself had come to meet her. He was a round, pleasant man in his 50s with spectacles and an air of permanent mild anxiety. "I am Harold Fenwick. Welcome to Millard Creek." "Thank you, Mr. Fenwick," Jennie said, shaking his hand with a firmness that made him blink. "I'm very glad to be here. Where shall I start?" He blinked again. "Start with the books," she said. "I assume they need attention." "Well, yes," Harold said, "but you have only just arrived. Surely you would like to settle in first." "I would like to settle in and look at the books at the same time," Jennie said pleasantly, picking up her traveling bag. "Which direction is the store?" Harold Fenwick pointed, and Jennie walked in that direction, and several of the people who had been loitering near the stage depot exchanged glances that communicated something between admiration and apprehension. She settled into the small room Harold rented out above the storage area, which he had prepared with a cot, a washstand, and a window that looked south toward the open plain. Within 3 days, she had reorganized Harold's accounts from 1876 onward, identified 6 unpaid debts that he had either forgotten or been too gentle to pursue, and established a filing system that made him weep with relief in a purely metaphorical sense, though his eyes did water slightly when she showed it to him. The town took notice of Jennie Leland the way small towns take notice of anyone new, which is to say thoroughly and somewhat intrusively. The women at the Sunday social asked her about her family, her prospects, and her intentions with enough thoroughness to constitute a formal examination. The men at the feed store observed her passing with expressions ranging from friendly to speculative. The children simply followed her occasionally, drawn by some quality of her attention when she looked at them, which was direct and genuine in a way that children recognized instinctively. What Millard Creek made of Jennie Leland after the first 2 weeks was this: she was capable, she was fair, she was pleasant when pleased and honest when not, and she had an unusual quality that people struggled to name precisely. It was something in the way she looked at other people. She looked at them as if she was genuinely interested in exactly what they were, without the accompanying expectation that they should be different. This quality would matter a great deal in about 10 days' time. Reuben Whitaker came to Fenwick's General Store on the first Monday of May to buy fencing wire, salt blocks, and a new pair of work gloves because he had worn through the left palm of his old pair, and had been refusing to replace them for 3 weeks on the grounds that they still had functional right hands. Clara Higgins, the postmistress, had pointed this out to him and suggested it might be time for new ones. He had responded that he would buy new gloves when he needed new gloves, not when other people needed him to have new gloves. Clara had told him he was the most pig-headed man in creation. He had said thank you and walked away. He came into the store in the middle of the morning, trailing the smell of horse and grass and sun-warmed leather, and stopped at the counter to find himself looking at a woman he had never seen before. She was standing behind the counter with Harold Fenwick's ledger open in front of her, running a column of figures with a pencil, and she did not look up immediately. "I will be right with you," she said, still running the column. Her finger reached the bottom of the page. She made a small notation, then looked up. Reuben was looking at her with the direct, unvarnished expression that he applied to most things, which was something between assessment and curiosity and carried no particular social lubricant. "You are not Harold Fenwick," he said. "No," Jennie agreed. "He is in the back storeroom checking inventory. I am Jennie Leland. I keep the accounts. What can I help you with?" "Fencing wire," Reuben said. "2 spools of the 14 gauge, salt blocks 4 of them, and work gloves." Jennie wrote this down. "We have the 14 gauge in stock. Salt blocks are around back." "Gloves," she said, moving to the glass case along the wall. "We have the heavy cowhide work style, or the lighter canvas if you need more movement. Looking at your hands, I would say the cowhide." He was quiet for a moment. Most people, when they looked at his hands, told him he ought to wear his gloves more consistently. It was a reflexive correction that he had come to anticipate with the weariness of a man who hears the same sermon repeated. Jennie was not saying that. She was simply observing what his hands indicated about the kind of work he did and making a practical recommendation. "Cowhide," he said. She set a pair on the counter. Pulled one on, flexed it, pulled it off, and laid it back down. "Those will do," he said. "I will add them to the total," she said. "Do you have an account with the store, or will you be paying today?" "Account," he said. "Whitaker, Reuben Whitaker." She found the ledger page and made the entries. "I will let Mr. Fenwick know about the wire and the salt blocks. He will have them loaded for you." Reuben picked up his gloves and watched her write for a moment. "You are new," he said. It was not quite a question. "About 2 weeks," she said. "Are you from close by?" "Southeast," he said. "Whitaker Ranch." "I have heard the name," she said. There was a brief silence, the kind that could have gone several directions. Reuben waited with some private interest to see what direction this woman would take it. Most people, having heard his name, either became elaborately casual or said something along the lines of how they supposed he was not as difficult as people said. Both responses irritated him for the same fundamental reason, which was that they were both attempts to manage the interaction. Jennie went back to her ledger column. "I will tell Mr. Fenwick about the wire," she said. Reuben walked out of the store and stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment in the spring sun, aware of a sensation he could not immediately classify. It was not attraction exactly, though she was certainly handsome enough. It was more like the feeling of having expected a door to swing in one direction and finding it swung the other way. Unexpected, faintly interesting. He put his hat on and went around back for his supplies. Over the following weeks, Reuben found himself at Fenwick's store with somewhat more frequency than his actual supply needs warranted. He was aware of this. He was not the kind of man who hid things from himself. He came in on a Wednesday for coffee and lamp oil, and spent 20 minutes discussing the ongoing drought conditions to the southwest with Jennie, who asked questions about the range, grass, and water table with a quality of interest that was neither polite nor performative, but simply genuine. He came in the following Saturday and ended up sitting on the porch rail outside while Jennie took her midday break with a cup of coffee, and they talked about the cattle market and the railroad spur that the county had been debating for 3 years. And she said, with clear-eyed directness, that she thought the men opposing the spur were afraid of what a railroad would do to the power arrangements in the county, and Reuben had looked at her for a second and said, "Yes, that is exactly right," with the slightly surprised tone of someone who had expected to have to explain the third step of a long argument, and found his companion had already arrived there independently. He did not tell her she was remarkable. He did not reach for flattery. He simply turned the conversation to what might actually be done about the railroad opposition, and she engaged with that directly, and when they parted an hour later, both of them went back to their respective work with a quality of satisfaction that was quiet and genuine. The town noticed. The town noticed everything. Clara Higgins said to Mabel Dowd, the milliner, that she had seen Reuben Whitaker lean against the store porch rail and talk to the Leland woman for a full hour without once making that face he made when he was looking for an escape. Mabel Dowd said she supposed any woman could talk to a man for an hour if she was pretty enough. Clara Higgins said it was not that. She had watched. The Leland woman did not behave any differently with Reuben than she behaved with anyone else, which was to say she was straight and direct and genuinely interested, and she did not appear to be managing him in any way. Mabel said that was strange. Clara said it was more than strange. She said it was the first time in 11 years she had seen Reuben Whitaker look comfortable in a conversation that was not about cattle or fence wire. Reuben had a ranch hand named Dally Cruz, 25 years old and loyal as a well-trained dog, who had worked the Whitaker place for 4 years and had developed, through daily proximity, an ability to read Reuben's silences with some precision. Dally noticed that Reuben had started coming back from town in the early summer not with the slightly compressed expression of a man who has endured the necessary unpleasantness of human contact, but with a quality of quiet that was different. Settled rather than relieved, Dally asked him once carefully if there was something new happening in town. Reuben said there was a new bookkeeper at Fenwick's. Dally asked if she was good at the work. Reuben said she was better than good. Dally watched Reuben put his horse up with a kind of methodical ease that suggested a man whose mind was occupied by something pleasant, and Dally said nothing more, because he was wise enough to know when to leave things alone. It was the last week of June, hot and clear and smelling of dry grass, when things between Reuben and Jennie shifted. He had come in for rope and tallow, and had found Jennie not behind the counter but out front, sitting on the porch steps with a letter in her lap and a quality of stillness that was different from her usual self-possessed calm. It was the stillness of someone holding something difficult. He stopped at the foot of the steps. "What is it?" Jennie looked up. She had made a rule in her years of independence not to perform emotions for the benefit of others or suppress them to the point of dishonesty. She said simply, "A letter from my brother. He is having a hard time of it in Missouri. His wife is ill and his crop failed last year and he is asking if I have any money to spare." Reuben sat down on the step beside her. He did not say anything immediately. He read her face with the same direct attention he gave everything, not searching for what to say to make her feel better, simply present with what was actually happening. "Do you have money to spare?" he asked. "Some," she said. "Not as much as he needs. I can send what I have, but it will leave me short for the next 2 months. Does the shortness worry you?" "Not greatly," she said. "I have the position here. Harold is fair. I will recover it, but I do not like feeling thin in my finances. It makes me feel the ground shifting." "Understandable," Reuben said. Jennie looked at the letter again. "He always needed more help than the rest of us," she said. "My brother, he is a good man. He simply does not have the stomach for hard luck. He folds." "Some people do," Reuben said, not with judgment, simply as an observation of the natural variety in people. "I fold in other ways," Jennie said. "Just not that way." Reuben was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I could advance you against the next 2 months of orders from the store. The Whitaker account is substantial. Fenwick would see it as the same as payment." Jennie turned to look at him fully. "That is a generous offer," she said. "It is a practical one," he said. "I am in the store most weeks anyway. The money will move through normally. You will not feel the ground shifting." She studied him with those green eyes. He did not look away or add anything to soften or dress up the offer. He had said what he meant, and now he was waiting. "All right," she said. "Thank you, Reuben." It was the first time she had used his given name. He was aware of it in the same way he was aware of a change in wind direction, a physical, actual shift in atmosphere. "You are welcome, Jennie," he said. He went inside to get his rope and tallow, and Jennie sat on the steps with her letter and felt, for the first time in 8 months of managing entirely on her own, that the ground under her feet was firm. She sent money to her brother in Missouri. He wrote back 3 weeks later saying it had saved them, that his wife was recovering, that he was deeply grateful. Jennie read the letter in the evening and felt both the warm satisfaction of having helped and a very clear, very honest acknowledgement, which she permitted herself in private, that it had been made possible in part by a man with dark eyes and a reputation for being impossible. July in Millard Creek was fierce. The heat came off the plain in waves, and the cattle were restless with it, and the men who worked the range wore their hats low and their bandanas wet, and moved with the efficiency of people who knew that the heat would take what you gave it and ask for more. Reuben worked long days, rising before light and coming in after dark, and the ranch was a demanding enterprise in the summer. He still came to town on Thursdays. He and Jennie had fallen into the quiet habit of people who have found each other's company genuinely useful. She told him about things she had read, because she ordered books through Harold's supplier in Wichita and read them in the evenings, and Reuben had an appetite for information that was not matched by any particular patience for sitting still long enough to read. She had the rare gift of speaking about ideas without being condescending, which he appreciated with a depth he did not immediately put into words. He told her about the land, about the specific character of different stretches of the plain, where the grass held longer in a drought and why, where the water ran underground and how you knew it, what the sky looked like before a tornado in a way that was not simply atmospheric but actually instructional. She listened with the full attention of someone for whom information had always been a tool rather than an ornament. They argued sometimes about whether the town council's plan for a new water pumping system was sound. She said it was adequate but not long-sighted. He said it was a waste of money for a temporary solution. And they went back and forth for 40 minutes before arriving at a compromise position that neither of them had started with, which was itself a remarkable thing where Reuben was concerned. About whether Harold Fenwick was charging too little for his goods out of excessive kindness, and therefore undermining his own business, she said yes. He said it was Harold's business to run as Harold saw fit. She said that was true, but also Harold had a family and a community depending on the store remaining solvent, and Reuben had gone quiet in the way that meant he was rethinking something, which was not surrender but was genuine reconsideration, which in Reuben's world was a fairly enormous thing. She did not try to soften him. When he was blunt, she was blunt back. When he said something that she thought was wrong, she said it was wrong and told him why. She did not apologize for having a view. She did not wrap her disagreements in enough pleasantries to make them palatable. She simply said what she thought. And she never, not once, suggested he should be different. Not when he told the county assessor, in Jennie's presence one Thursday morning, that his land assessment was either incompetent or dishonest, and he would be challenging it in full. Not when he declined, with unvarnished directness, the invitation of Pastor Green to speak at the harvest social on the grounds that he had nothing to say that the assembled company would find useful. Not when he told Dallie's mother, who had come to town and expressed concern about her son's habit of gambling at the Long Rail Saloon, that Dallie was a grown man and what he did with his wages was his own business, and that perhaps she might trust the 25 years of life experience she had raised him to have. Jennie witnessed all of these. She had opinions about some of them. She shared those opinions when they were alone, directly and without theatrics. But she never said, not once, "You should not have said that," or "You might try saying it more gently," or "Have you considered how that lands on people?" which was the exact language that made something go flat behind Reuben's eyes. Because she was not trying to change him. She was simply responding to him, as one full person responds to another full person, which is to say with honesty, engagement, and the fundamental respect of taking him at face value. Reuben was aware of this the way you are aware of the sun once the clouds clear. Not a sudden revelation, but a gradual and then overwhelming warmth. It was a Thursday in late August when he asked her to ride with him. He had come to the store in the late afternoon, which was unusual. He usually came in the mornings. He found her doing the closing accounts and waited until she had finished, then said, while she was putting the ledger away, "I am riding out to the east pasture tomorrow morning to check the fence line. It is good country. If you wanted to see the land, you are welcome to come." Jennie put the last book on its shelf and turned around. "I have not ridden much," she said, "not in some years." "I have a horse that would suit you," he said. "She is sensible. She will not give you trouble." Jennie looked at him for a moment. "What time?" she said. "Sunrise," he said. "I will bring the horse." She was at the store door at sunrise. In a divided skirt she had made herself 2 years ago in Wichita, because she had decided that sitting sideways on a horse while trying to maintain any kind of functional movement was a piece of social convention she had no use for, and a cotton shirtwaist and boots with her hair braided back under her hat. Reuben arrived with 2 horses, including a pale gray mare named Rosalie, who was exactly as sensible as promised, and they rode out of Millard Creek as the sun came up orange and enormous over the flat plain and turned the grass to a color that was halfway between gold and green. They did not talk much for the first hour. The land asked for quiet in the morning, and they both knew it. They rode east away from the town, and the plain opened up around them, and the sky was so large and so clear that it had a quality of pressure, the way something very beautiful has, like it is asking something of you. Eventually Reuben said, "What do you see?" Jennie looked around at the land. "Room," she said. "More room than I have ever seen in one place." "Most people say empty," Reuben said. "That is because they are looking for what they already know," Jennie said. "I am looking at what is actually here." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." They reached the east fence line, and he checked the posts while she held the horses, and then they rode along the fence south, and he showed her where a section had been pushed by last winter's freeze and would need resetting, and where the grass was different in color because there was a shallow draw underground that held water when the surface was dry. She asked questions. He answered them. She paid attention to the answers and asked follow-up questions that indicated she had processed what he said, which was the kind of conversation Reuben found so rare as to be almost disorienting. They stopped at midday at a slight rise that gave a view for miles in 3 directions. He had brought food in his saddlebag, the kind of plain, practical food a man brings on a working ride: hard bread, dried beef, dried apricots, a canteen. They sat on the ground at the top of the rise and ate and looked out over the plain. "I think I understand now," Jennie said, "why you will not be moved." Reuben looked at her. "People try to change you," she said. "I have heard about it. Clara Higgins has opinions. Half the town has opinions." "They do," he said. "But this is your ground," she said, "not metaphorically. Literally." She gestured at the land. "You have had 11 years of this much space and this much quiet and this much room to be exactly who you are. Being managed would feel like a fence going up in the middle of it." He was looking at her with an expression that was not his usual assessment, but something more exposed, something that looked, if you knew him well enough to read it, like recognition. "That is the clearest anyone has ever put it," he said. "I am not offering it as a criticism," she said, "or an excuse. I am just observing what I see." "I know," he said. They were quiet for a while, and the wind moved through the grass below them with a sound like a long, even breath. "Does it ever get lonely?" she asked. She was not asking with pity. She was asking the way she asked everything, with genuine curiosity about the actual answer. Reuben thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said. "Not in the way people think, not for company exactly. For someone who sees the same things I see and does not feel the need to change the view." Jennie did not say anything immediately. She was looking out at the land. "I think I understand that kind of lonely too," she said finally. The ride back to town was long and easy and comfortable, and neither of them said anything particularly important, and both of them felt the particular lightness of having said something true. He helped her dismount when they reached the store, which she did not need but allowed because the gesture was genuine and not performative, and as she handed him Rosalie's reins, their hands were briefly in the same space, and she looked up at him in the late afternoon light, and he looked back, and neither of them said a word because neither of them needed to. He rode back to the ranch, and Dally, who had been fixing the gate, took one look at him and turned immediately back to the gate in the wise manner of someone giving a man his privacy. September brought a series of events that Millard Creek would discuss for a long time after. The first was the arrival of a man named Porter Sales, who came in on the Friday stage and presented himself at Harold Fenwick's store with a proposal. He was from a land acquisition company based in Topeka, and he had papers and a very smooth manner, and he wanted to buy up the water rights to a section of the creek that ran through several properties southeast of town, including Reuben's. He had already spoken to two other landowners, Hector Bell and old Tom Kastner, both of whom had sold their rights for what Porter Sales described as a very fair price, which was about a third of what those rights were actually worth to someone who understood what controlling the water in that stretch meant for the long-term development of the corridor. Porter Sales came to Reuben's ranch on a Wednesday. He was there when Jennie rode out to deliver a supply order that Harold had asked her to take, because he had a bad knee that week. She pulled up to the yard and heard the conversation from the gate, which was in clear earshot, because Reuben was not the kind of man who conducted business indoors when the outdoors was available. Porter Sales was speaking in his smooth, reasonable tone about fair prices and mutual benefit and the future of Kansas development, and Reuben was listening with his arms folded and his hat pushed back slightly, which Jennie had come to recognize as the posture of a man who has already made up his mind and is simply waiting for the other party to run out of words. When Porter Sales finished, Reuben said, "No." Porter Sales began again, with a variation on the original argument. Reuben waited again. "No," Reuben said again when he was done. "Not for that price, not for any price. The water rights to this land are not for sale. Come back with something else." Porter Sales shifted tactics. He mentioned that the other landowners had already sold, making Reuben's refusal something of a complication for the development plan. Reuben said that was Porter Sales's problem. He mentioned that there might be legal avenues. Reuben said he was welcome to try them. Porter Sales left with his smooth manner somewhat dented. Jennie dismounted and brought the supply box around to the kitchen door and found Reuben there. "I heard," she said, "about the water rights." "I know," he said, taking the supply box. "He mentioned legal avenues," she said. "He did. He may mean it," she said. "There has been movement in Topeka this past year on water acquisition. I read about it in the Kansas newspapers. There are ways a well-funded company can force a price through legal channels. It is not right, but it happens." Reuben looked at her. "What would you suggest?" This was itself remarkable. Reuben Whitaker asking someone what they would suggest was not nothing. Jennie thought for a moment. "Document the usage," she said. "Everything. How long you have been using the water, what volume, what it represents to the ranch operation. That kind of documented record is the best defense against acquisition claims. Also, if the other landowners who sold are willing, getting them to state on paper what they were offered might help establish the inadequacy of the pricing. A lawyer in Wichita who handles land claims would be worth the trip." Reuben was quiet for a long moment. "You know property law." "I know the edges of it," she said. "Enough to know when to find someone who knows the middle of it." He said, "I will go to Wichita next week." She nodded. "Will you come with me?" he said. The question was plain and direct, delivered in exactly the tone he used for every request, which meant it carried no manipulation, no social pressure, no implicit weight beyond the actual ask. He wanted her company for a practical reason and also, clearly, simply for itself. "Yes," Jennie said. "I will come." They went to Wichita on the following Tuesday, on the morning stage, arriving in the early afternoon and spending 3 hours at the office of a lawyer named Walter Crisp, who was thorough and honest, and told them that Jennie's reading of the situation was substantially correct, and that a documented usage record combined with a challenge to the acquisition company's filing process would likely protect the Whitaker property at minimal legal expense. He also said the price paid to Bell and Kastner was, in his professional opinion, roughly insulting. On the train platform, waiting for the return stage, Jennie said, "Are you going to tell Bell and Kastner?" "I do not know that it helps them," Reuben said. "The deal is done." "It might help them the next time," Jennie said, "and it is honest." He looked at her. "You are right," he said. "I will tell them." They were sitting side by side on the stage platform bench, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and the afternoon sun was warm and the Wichita street was alive with the particular noise of a cattle town in the working week. And Jennie was looking at the street with that expression she had, that quality of interested attention, and Reuben was looking at her profile. "Jennie," he said. She turned to look at him. He had not prepared this. He did not prepare things of this kind because preparation implied that you were uncertain what you meant, and he was not uncertain. "I would like to court you," he said, "properly if you are willing, and if you are not, I would rather know now than find out later." Jennie looked at him for a long moment. The wind on the platform moved a strand of hair across her cheek, and she did not bother with it. "I am willing," she said. He nodded. She turned back to the street, and he turned back to the street, and the stage rattled around the corner and stopped in front of them, and they climbed in together, and the journey home was full of nothing more than the comfortable proximity of two people who have just agreed on something real. The courtship of Reuben Whitaker and Jennie Leland was, by Millard Creek standards, somewhat unusual, in that it did not look particularly different from their previous association. They did not suddenly acquire the stagey quality that some couples got, the self-conscious performance of romance for the benefit of onlookers. They went on together in the same direct, engaged manner they had always had, except that now he arrived at the store on Thursdays with a small thing for her. Once a book he had ordered through the Wichita supplier, once a specific kind of dried peach that she had mentioned in passing she liked, and he had acquired from a trader at some effort. Once simply a handful of the late wildflowers from the eastern pasture that he laid on the counter without particular ceremony, and she received with a smile that was warm and unguarded, and which he held in his memory for days afterward. She went to the ranch twice more in September, and each time she moved through the working day beside him, helping where help was useful, staying out of the way where it was not, and he showed her things with the unself-conscious generosity of a man sharing something he genuinely loves. She met Dally Cruz, who tipped his hat and said, "Ma'am," and then said to Reuben later with an expression of quiet satisfaction, "She is not trying to fix you." "No," Reuben said. "That is a good thing to find," Dally said. "Yes," Reuben said. Porter Sales made one more attempt in early October, this time with a more aggressive legal filing that Walter Crisp's Wichita office dispatched in less than a week. The acquisition company withdrew their interest in the Whitaker water rights entirely, likely deciding the expense of a prolonged legal fight was not worth the outcome. Reuben received the news on a Thursday morning and walked to Fenwick's store and told Jennie, and she said, "Good," with satisfaction, and then went back to her accounts, and he stood at the counter and watched her work for a moment with an expression that Dally, had he been there, would have recognized immediately. November came cold and early. The plains turned brown and the sky went the color of pewter, and the wind had an edge to it that was unambiguous about its intentions. Reuben spent the last weeks of the fall doing the annual work of a man preparing his ranch for winter, and Jennie helped herald through the peak of the harvest supply rush, and the beginning of the quiet that came after, when the farmers had stocked what they needed, and the town settled into its winter mode. They had Sunday dinners together at the boarding house dining room, which was the Millard Creek equivalent of a formal social occasion, and Clara Higgins saw them there twice in November, and told Mabel Dowd that it was the most civilized courtship she had ever witnessed in the county, and that the Leland woman must have a secret, because she had managed to sit across the table from Reuben Whitaker for 2 hours without him developing that expression. Mabel said she thought the secret was that there was no secret, that the woman simply liked the man as he was, and Clara said that was the most radical thing she had heard anyone say in years. Reuben asked Jennie to marry him on the first Saturday of December. He had told Dally the night before with the straightforward manner of a man reporting a decision already made that he was going to ask her tomorrow. Dally had stopped what he was doing and looked at him and said, "Does she know you are coming?" "No," Reuben said. "And if she says no," Reuben thought about this, "she will not say no." Dally smiled. How do you know? Reuben was quiet for a moment. Because she does not say things she does not mean, he said, and she has not said no to any part of this. He went to the store on Saturday morning, not his usual day, and found Jennie in the back organizing the new winter stock, methodically stacking bolts of heavy wool flannel on the high shelf with a stool she used to reach the top. She heard him and said over her shoulder, "Harold is at the counter." "I am not here for Harold," Reuben said. She turned on the stool and looked down at him, which was an interesting reversal of their usual positioning. "I am here to ask you to marry me," he said. "I want to be clear about what I am and what I am not, so that you are saying yes to the actual thing and not something you have imagined. I am not a sociable man. I will not be a different kind of man with a ring on my finger. I am not gentle with people who irritate me, and I irritate easily. I have a ranch that is in good shape but requires hard work. I do not have a lot of patience for pretense. What I do have is my word, which I have never broken, and enough land and cattle to keep a family well, and a very clear and honest regard for you that I do not imagine going away." Jennie was still on the stool, which meant she was looking down at him, and her expression was the warmest he had ever seen on her face, which was saying something because her face was not cold at any time. "I know what I am saying yes to," she said. "Yes." He reached up and took her hand, which was the most openly tender thing he had done with her, and she held his hand on the step of the stool, and they stayed like that for a long moment, and the winter light came through the storeroom window and lay across both of them. And outside, in the distance, the wind moved through the empty street of Millard Creek like it had nowhere particular to be. "Get down off the stool," he said. She laughed, which was a sound he wanted, he realized, to hear for the rest of his life, and she stepped down. They were married in the spring, on the first warm Saturday of April 1879, in the small white church at the east end of Millard Creek's Main Street, with Pastor Green officiating and half the town in attendance because the whole town was curious, and also because Jennie had made genuine friends in her year here, and because even Reuben's neighbors had a complicated affection for him that expressed itself, on occasions like this, as faithful presents. Jennie wore a dress of ivory cotton with a small pattern of blue flowers that she had made herself over the winter, and she wore her hair up under a ribbon and no hat, because the day was warm and the sky was clear, and she said it seemed wrong to block any of it out. Reuben wore his best shirt and his good trousers and his clean hat and his Sunday boots, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her walk down the narrow aisle without the polished church floor or the borrowed flowers or the weight of ceremony on her face, just the expression she always had, that direct and genuine attention, and he felt something large and quiet settle in him like a river finding its bed. The vows were the standard ones. Reuben said his clearly and without decoration, in the same voice he used for every true thing. Jennie said hers the same way, looking at him straight on. Clara Higgins cried. Mabel Dowd did not, but it was a near thing. Dally Cruz stood in the back row and smiled at the floor. The celebration afterward was at the Fenwick property, in the yard behind the store, where Harold had set up tables and a few of the ranch wives had brought food, and a fiddle player from out past the Bell farm had been convinced to attend. It was not a fancy affair. It was food and music and the outdoors, and Jennie danced with Harold Fenwick and with Dally, and with one of the Kastner boys who was about 19 and painfully nervous about it, and Reuben stood at the edge of the yard with a cup of coffee and watched his wife move through the afternoon light with that particular pleasure that is available only to someone who has let themselves want something and then actually received it. She came to stand beside him eventually. "You are not dancing," she said. "I am watching you dance," he said. "Which is better?" She leaned against his shoulder for a moment, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together in the late afternoon of the first day of their marriage and looked at the people they knew moving in the yard with the ease of a spring afternoon. They drove out to the ranch in the evening, Reuben's wagon loaded with the modest belongings Jennie was bringing with her, the books mainly, and the small items she had accumulated in her year above Harold Fenwick's store. The ranch house was a good solid structure, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, built to last rather than to impress, and Reuben had spent the previous month expanding it, adding a second room and plastering the walls smooth, and putting in a window in the main room that faced south, toward the open plain. He had not told her about the window. She found it when they arrived and stood in front of it in the evening light, looking out at the plain, and turned around and looked at him. "You put that in," she said. "You said you liked looking south," he said. She crossed the room and put her hands against his chest and looked up at him, and he put his arms around her, and the ranch settled into the quiet of the evening around them, and the stars came out over the Kansas plain, and the wind was gentle that night. The first year of their marriage was full in the way that a good year on the plain is full, not with ease exactly, but with substance. The ranch required everything it always had, and Jennie brought her own particular capabilities to it without trying to reorganize what was already working, which was itself an act of respect that Reuben noticed and was grateful for. She kept the ranch accounts with the same efficiency she had applied to Harold's books, which meant that, for the first time in 11 years, Reuben had a clear and current picture of his financial standing at all times, which he found both useful and faintly disconcerting. She also turned out to have a genuine talent with the ranch horses. She had said she had not ridden much in some years, which was true, but she had a quality of calmness around animals that they responded to, and within a few months she was riding Rosalie on the range and checking the water troughs in the north pasture as a matter of course. They argued with the same frequency and the same direct engagement that they had before the marriage, which is to say regularly and without lasting damage. He had views she disagreed with, and she told him so. She had habits he found maddening, including a tendency to read at the table after supper when he was trying to talk, and he told her so. She put the book down when he said it, which was not capitulation but simply a decision about priorities in the moment, and then she engaged with what he wanted to talk about, which was all he had actually wanted. The spring of 1880 brought 2 significant things. The first was the railroad spur, which finally came through the county after the 3-year debate resolved itself in the way that Jennie had predicted, with the removal of 2 of the most significant opponents from the town council through the ordinary mechanism of election. The spur station would be built 2 miles west of Millard Creek, which meant a road, and the road meant new business, and the new business meant the town was going to grow. Harold Fenwick, at Jennie's firm urging, expanded his stock inventory in advance of the growth, and arrived at the expansion having already absorbed the cost through a year of careful profit setting aside. He was the best-positioned merchant in town when the new people started arriving, which made him so grateful to Jennie that he reduced the price on her standing orders for the next year entirely on his own initiative. The second significant thing was the news, confirmed by the doctor from the next county who came through Millard Creek on his quarterly circuit, that Jennie was expecting. Reuben received this information with a quality of stillness that was different from his usual stillness, which was the stillness of a man in control of himself. This was the stillness of a man who is being expanded, who is discovering that there is more room inside him than he knew. "Well," he said after a moment. "Well," Jennie agreed. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "I feel well. Dr. Harmon says everything seems straightforward." "Good," Reuben said. He was quiet for another moment. "I am glad," he said then, which from Reuben Whitaker in this particular moment was an enormous thing. Jennie reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. "So am I," she said. Their son was born in late November of 1880, delivered by the doctor and attended by Mabel Dowd, who had turned out to be, under her dry exterior, a capable and calming presence in a birth room, and by Dally's mother, who had buried her earlier disagreement with Reuben after several years of watching him care for her son's livelihood and employment with genuine reliability, and who had a midwife's experience that proved invaluable. The boy was healthy and loud, with Reuben's dark eyes already visible through the squinting newborn face, and Reuben held him in his large, work-roughened hands with the careful and extraordinary tenderness of a man encountering a mystery he has no interest in dismissing. They named him Samuel. Reuben sat in the chair beside the bed where Jennie lay, tired and warm and satisfied, and held the boy and did not speak for a long time, and Jennie watched him and felt the full weight and richness of the life they had made. "He has your hands," Jennie said eventually. "My hands are not something to give a person," Reuben said, looking at the small, perfect fingers. "I disagree," Jennie said. "Your hands built this house. Your hands worked this land. Your hands have never been anything other than honest. I can think of worse things to pass on." Reuben looked at her. In the lamplight in the November chill of the ranch house, with the wind outside and the fire in the stove, he looked at her with the full, unguarded weight of everything he felt, which was not his usual mode but which she received without flinching, because she was Jennie Leland Whitaker and she did not flinch from real things. "You are the best thing in my life," he said, not with grandeur, simply as a fact. "You are the best thing in mine," she said the same way. Samuel Whitaker grew as healthy boys grow on working ranches, with the outdoors in his lungs from the start and the rhythm of the land in his body, before he was old enough to understand it. He was, as early as 3 years old, clearly going to have his father's stubbornness, which Jennie found both genuinely amusing and occasionally trying, and she handled it the same way she had handled Reuben's stubbornness from the beginning, which was by taking it seriously without trying to eradicate it, by responding to the actual person rather than the behavior she wished she was seeing instead. Reuben watched her with Samuel and felt something that was in the same family as what he felt when he stood on the rise in the east pasture and looked at the plain, a sense of being in the presence of something exactly right. The town of Millard Creek changed around the Whitaker Ranch in the years that followed the railroad spur. New families came in. A second dry goods store opened, which worried Harold Fenwick until Jennie sat down with him, and they worked through a strategy that differentiated his inventory and customer base from the competitors. And he discovered that competition, managed intelligently, was not the disaster he had feared. A school building was built and a permanent teacher hired, a young man named George Tipton from Ohio who was earnest and well-read, and who became, over several years, a genuine friend to both Reuben and Jennie, which surprised many people because George Tipton was mild and sociable and Reuben was neither. But the two found common ground in a shared appetite for direct speech and a low tolerance for the kind of community politics that mistook discussion for action. Reuben expanded the ranch in 1882, buying 60 acres to the southeast when Tom Kastner's eldest son decided to sell and move to Colorado. The additional land included a better section of the creek, which had a particular significance given the earlier fight over water rights, and Reuben walked that section of the creek in the first week. He owned it with a quality of satisfaction that was deep and real. Jennie went with him on that walk, as she went with him on most things that mattered, not as an appendage but as a partner with her own eyes and her own thoughts, and when they reached the section of the creek that ran most strongly, she said, "This is what Porter Sales was really after." "Yes," Reuben said. "I am glad you held," she said. "You helped me hold it," he said. "I told you to find a lawyer," she said. "You held it. With better information," he said, "which is not nothing." She took his arm as they walked back along the creek, and the late summer sun was on the water and the cottonwoods along the bank were already showing the first yellow of the season, and the plain was everywhere around them, and the particular quality of the light in late afternoon in southern Kansas was the most beautiful thing either of them knew. Their second child was born in the summer of 1883, a girl they named May, after the month that had been particularly gentle that year, and she arrived into a household that was already fully itself, confident and warm and direct, and she arrived with her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair and an expression, even at a few weeks old, of cheerful determination that made Dally, who met her for the first time when she was 3 weeks old, say she had the Whitaker look. "She has the Leland look," Jennie corrected. "Both looks," Dally said diplomatically. Reuben was 40 years old when May was born, and the ranch was the best it had ever been, the herd large and in good condition, the finances stable and clearly understood, the property well maintained. He had built a second structure on the ranch property, a proper smokehouse and a root cellar, and the ranch house had been expanded again to accommodate the family with a genuine second bedroom and a proper kitchen separated from the main living space. He had not changed. He was still the most direct and least manageable man in the county, and this was still acknowledged by everyone who knew him as an immutable fact of local life. He still said what he saw. He still declined what he did not want with no particular apology. He still had no patience for pretense and made no effort to acquire any. But something in him had opened, not in the way that people who had tried to change him had wanted it to open, which was toward a softened version of the same person. It had opened the way land opens when you know it well enough, deeper and more itself, with more room in it than appeared from the outside. Clara Higgins said to Mabel Dowd in the fall of 1883 that Reuben Whitaker was a different man than he had been 5 years ago, and she could not put her finger on how. Mabel Dowd said she knew how. She said Jennie Whitaker had never tried to change him once in 5 years of knowing him, and what happened when you stopped pushing against something immovable was that it started to move, just not in the direction you were pushing. Clara thought about this for a long time. "That is the most philosophical thing you have ever said, Mabel," she said finally. "I have my moments," Mabel said. The winter of 1884 brought a particular cold that tested the county, and the Whitaker Ranch came through it with the resilience of a place that had been properly prepared. They had their stores, their good wood, their tight buildings, and the livestock was well sheltered. Reuben worked every cold day with the same methodical endurance he brought to everything, and Jennie kept the household running with the efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped doing things for show and only did them because they needed doing. Samuel, who was 4 years old by then, followed Reuben everywhere that weather permitted, with the earnest determination of a boy who has decided his father is the primary text to be studied in life. Reuben showed him things with patience. He was, as a father, surprisingly patient in the practical sense, not in the decorative sense where one performs patience as a social virtue, but in the genuine sense of taking the time to show someone how to do a thing correctly, because it matters that it is done correctly. Jennie watched this and felt, on certain quiet afternoons, that all the pieces of her life were where they should be, which was not a feeling she had been able to reliably locate before the age of 26 on a Tuesday afternoon in April, stepping off a stage into a flat wind and a stranger town. In the spring of 1885, Harold Fenwick told Jennie that he intended to sell the store. His wife's health was failing, and they wanted to go east to be near her family in Ohio, and he had found a buyer, a young man from Kansas City named Ellis Webb, who seemed capable and honest. He asked Jennie if she would consider staying on as bookkeeper for the new owner, which was a decision he left entirely to her. Jennie told him she was grateful, but that the store work was less necessary to her circumstances now than it had been when she arrived, and that she thought her primary work was the ranch, which was true. The Whitaker Ranch accounts alone were a substantial ongoing task, and she had also, over the past 2 years, been helping 2 of the neighboring ranches with their accounts, which had developed organically from conversations and requests, and her inability to observe a disorganized set of ledgers without wanting to put it right. Harold said he understood entirely, and he thanked her for everything she had done for the store, with an emotion that was genuine and that she received with warmth. She went back to Millard Creek twice a week for the neighboring account work, and this became her professional life in a form she had not anticipated but found genuinely satisfying, the application of a particular skill in a context where it was needed and valued. She was good with numbers. She was good with the financial narratives that numbers told about how a business or a ranch was actually doing versus how it appeared to be doing. And she was trusted because she was straight. Reuben said, one evening in the fall of 1885, "You could work for more of them. Half the ranches in this county are run on instinct and good luck when it comes to the books." "I know," she said. "I am thinking about it." "You should do it," he said. "You are as good at it as anyone I have encountered, better." She looked at him over the table. "That is the closest thing to extravagant praise I have ever heard from you." "It is not extravagant," he said. "It is accurate." She smiled and went back to the ledger she was working on, and he watched her for a moment and felt that same settled quality, that sense of a river in its bed. The ranch bookkeeping practice grew through 1886 and into 1887, until Jennie was working with 6 ranches in the county, and had more work than she sometimes wanted but none more than she could handle. She had a desk built into the south room of the ranch house, beside the window that looked over the plain, and she worked there in the mornings when the children were occupied, and the afternoon light came across the ledgers and her careful handwriting, and the plain was always there outside the window. Reuben expanded the cattle operation in 1887 to include a breeding program for a hardier line that was better suited to the Kansas winters, which he had been thinking about for 3 years, and finally had the capital to pursue. The combination of good water rights, sound finances, and 17 years of accumulated knowledge about this particular piece of land meant the Whitaker Ranch had a reputation by the late 1880s that reached well beyond the county. Buyers came from as far as Missouri and Nebraska. Reuben dealt with them in his characteristic manner, which was to say directly and without embellishment, stating the price and the quality and the terms and then waiting, and the buyers learned quickly that there was no negotiation in the ordinary social sense. There was only the fair price and the honest assessment, and they came back year after year because honesty in the cattle business was rarer than fine grass. Samuel Whitaker, at 9 years old, was his father's constant apprentice on the ranch. He had inherited the stubbornness in full, which Jennie navigated with the skill of someone who had 9 years of practice, and which Reuben navigated with the unflinching recognition of someone looking in a very honest mirror. Father and son argued sometimes with the particular combustibility of two people who are too similar, and Jennie would let it run until it reached its natural end, which it always did, because both of them were too direct to hold grudges, and afterward they would return to whatever they had been doing with the compact ease of two people who have said the true thing and can therefore move past it. May Whitaker, at 5 years old, was different from her brother in every outward quality and identical to him in the essential one, which was that she knew her own mind and communicated it clearly. She had her mother's way with people, that quality of genuine attention, and her father's way with the land, a physical ease in the outdoors that expressed itself as a total absence of hesitation. She had been on a horse before she was 3 years old, held securely in front of Reuben, and by 5 she was on Rosalie alone in the yard. Life on the Whitaker Ranch in the late 1880s had the quality of a thing that has been built correctly and is therefore simply itself, without strain. It was not without difficulty. The drought year of 1887 tested everyone in the county, and the Whitaker Ranch came through it with the advantage of the good water rights and the careful preparation of recent years. But it was a near thing for the cattle, and required every bit of Reuben's 17 years of accumulated knowledge about this land. 2 neighboring ranches failed that year and sold, and Reuben helped both families during the worst of it without making anything of it, simply doing what was needed. One of those families, a couple named Peterson with 3 young children, found their situation particularly dire in the August heat, when their well dropped so low they could not water the stock. Reuben told them to move their cattle to his east pasture section where the creek still ran, and he said it in the same tone he said everything, matter of fact and without performance, and Lars Pedersen, who was a proud man and had spent 3 months keeping his difficulties to himself, said nothing for a moment and then said, "I am grateful, Reuben." Reuben said, "The grass is better on that side anyway. My cattle have been crowding it." Which was not true, but was a way of allowing the Pedersens their dignity. And Jennie, who heard this exchange from the kitchen doorway, felt the warmth that she always felt when she saw the person Reuben actually was through the surface of the person most people only saw. She said nothing about it that night. She never made a point of these moments. She simply noted them in the private ledger she kept of the man she had married, alongside the stubbornness and the bluntness and the complete inability to make small talk, as evidence of what she had understood from the beginning, that he was a good man, and that his goodness was most itself when no one was watching. He found her in the south room after supper, with the lamp lit and the ledger of the Pedersen accounts open, and she was making careful notes, and the window was dark now with the late evening, but she always left the curtain open anyway. "You are doing their books," he said. "Trying to find where they can save," she said. "They have more options than they realize." He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she was exactly who she had always been, this woman who had stepped off a stage on a Tuesday and looked at an unfamiliar town with the expression of someone who had every intention of being useful, and had proceeded to be useful in ways he could not have anticipated and had not asked for and could not have managed without. "Jennie," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him a moment. "For what?" "For being exactly who you are," he said. She set down her pencil and turned in the chair to face him properly. "Reuben Whitaker," she said, "that is the most unexpectedly sentimental thing you have ever said." "I am allowed to be sentimental occasionally," he said. "You are allowed to be anything you want," she said. "That is rather the point." He came into the room and sat in the chair opposite her, and the lamp was warm between them, and the plain was dark outside the south window, and they talked for an hour about the Pedersen accounts and the drought and the cattle market and the new school books that George Tipton had ordered for the Millard Creek school. And the conversation was the same as it always was, direct and engaged and genuine, and it was also, in its way, a love story told in the language of two people who preferred the actual world to the performed version of it. Their third child arrived in 1889, a boy they named Thomas, and he came into the world with the green eyes of the Lelands and the loud and certain opinion of the Whitakers and the combined stubbornness of both, which Reuben assessed at 3 days old and told Dally was going to be a significant management challenge for the next 20 years. Dally said, "Like father, like son." Reuben said, "I was never this loud." "Ask your mother," Dally said. Reuben's mother had died in 1875 before he came to Kansas, but the spirit of the remark was clear, and Reuben looked at his third child with the same extraordinary tenderness he had brought to the first two, which was the tenderness of a man who does not soften easily and therefore, when he does so completely. The ranch, by 1890, was one of the finest operations in the county. It was known for the quality of the cattle, for the soundness of the water management, for the reliability of the owner's word. Reuben Whitaker at 45 was as direct and as unmanageable as he had been at 33, which meant that the people who dealt with him had adjusted their expectations fully in his favor, and the people who still occasionally tried to nudge him towards social convention found the same flat, quiet expression they had always found, and learned in time to stop trying. What Millard Creek had come to understand over the decade of Reuben Whitaker's marriage was something more nuanced than the original verdict. He was still the most stubborn man in the county. That had not changed and would not change. But the stubbornness that had once seemed like a wall was now readable as something else, as the stable ground beneath a man's values, the refusal to be moved on the things that were genuinely worth holding. He held his land. He held his word. He held his family. He held his honest assessment of every situation he walked into. None of these things bent under pressure, and none of them were a problem. The summer of 1891 brought the first of what would become an annual tradition, a supper at the Whitaker Ranch on the fourth Saturday of July, attended by most of the people who had been woven into the life of the ranch over the years. The Fennicks before Harold sold and moved east, the Petersons who had steadied themselves after the drought year, Dally Cruz and his wife, a quiet woman named Ruth who he had married in 1886, and who had the same gift Jennie had of receiving the world without trying to rearrange it, George Tipton and his family, Clara Higgins, who had softened considerably in her assessments of Reuben over the decade, and now declared openly that she had been wrong about him in the early years, and various neighbors and occasional visitors who fell into the orbit of the Whitaker table and found it a hospitable place. It was at the July supper of 1891 that Samuel, who was 11 and recently engaged with the question of history that George Tipton had introduced him to, asked his father, in front of everyone, why people said he was the most stubborn man in the county. There was a moment of the particular held breath that happens in family gatherings when a child asks a question that lands in adult territory. Reuben looked at his son without embarrassment. "Because I am," he said. "But why?" Samuel said. Reuben thought for a moment. "Because I decided early on that I knew what I thought, and that changing what I thought should require a reason, not just pressure." Samuel considered this with the serious expression he had brought to most questions since he was 3. "What is the difference?" "A reason is an argument that is better than the one you already have," Reuben said. "Pressure is just someone wanting you to think something different without telling you why." Samuel thought about this. "Mother changes your mind sometimes," he said. "Your mother gives reasons," Reuben said. "That is different." Jennie across the table was looking at her plate with an expression of controlled amusement that Dally, beside her, noticed with something like reverence. "It is," she said, looking up. "And your father does the same for me. We argue correctly." "What does that mean?" Samuel asked. "It means we disagree about the truth," Jennie said, "rather than about who wins." Samuel sat with this for a while, and the supper went on around him. And the July evening was soft and warm and full of people who had become, through the years and the work and the particular quality of the household at the center of all of it, something that looked very much like a community. The years moved the way good years do on working land, with the rhythm of seasons and the accumulation of slow, genuine things. The Whitaker Ranch continued to grow by small and deliberate increments. The children grew with the same quality, slowly and genuinely. Samuel developed his father's seriousness and his mother's curiosity, and turned out, by the time he was a teenager, to have a natural authority over cattle that Reuben recognized with satisfaction as something that had been built correctly from the start. May became a reader, which made Jennie quietly triumphant and Reuben slightly wary, until he discovered that what May was reading was primarily natural history and geography, and that her passion for the land was even more specifically informed than his own, at which point he went to Harold's successor at the store and ordered her 3 more books on the subject without saying anything to anyone about it, and just left them on her desk. May found them and came to her father and said, "Are these from you?" he said. "The room needed something on that shelf." She looked at him with green eyes that were her mother's in every quality, that direct and genuine attention, and she said, "Thank you, Papa," he said. "They will be useful." Thomas grew into the combination of Whitaker stubbornness and Leland charm in a way that produced a child who was impossible to stay annoyed with for very long, because his absolute certainty about things was delivered with such genuine openness to the reactions it produced that it functioned more like an invitation than a demand. He was, at 7 years old, Jennie's shadow in the mornings and Reuben's shadow in the afternoons, and he had decided that both his parents were the most interesting people he had encountered, which he had told them directly because he had been raised in a household where you said what you meant. In the spring of 1895, Reuben rode the east pasture boundary alone, early in the morning before the family was up, as he had done every spring since the year he arrived on this land, and he stood on the low rise that gave the long view and looked out at the plain, which was greening again with the new grass, and the sky was the pale, enormous blue of a Kansas morning, and the creek caught the early light in the low section to the south. He was 50 years old. He had been on this land for 27 years. The ranch was in better shape than it had ever been. His wife was at the house, probably already at the desk in the south room with the window open to the spring air, and his children were growing into people who were genuinely themselves, which was the best thing he knew how to make. He stood on the rise for a long time, not because he was waiting for anything, but because he was here and the land was here and the morning was here, and these things were exactly what they should be. When he rode back, Jennie was at the kitchen door with coffee, and she handed it to him as he came in, the same way she had done 1,000 mornings, and he took it and looked at her, and she looked back, and there was nothing that needed saying right at that moment, and so neither of them said anything, and it was the perfect conversation. What the citizens of Millard Creek had come to understand by the mid-1890s was a truth that had taken about 15 years to settle into its final shape. The most stubborn man in the county had not been changed. He had been met. There was a difference, and it was the whole difference, and it was embodied entirely in Jennie Leland Whitaker, who had stepped off a stage one Tuesday in April of 1878 and looked at an unfamiliar town and an unfamiliar man with the same quality of honest and unmanipulative attention, and who had never, not once, looked at Reuben Whitaker and thought her job was to make him into something else. His job was to be what he was. Her job was to be what she was. And what they were together, on 460 acres of well-watered Kansas plain, with the cattle and the horses and the good fence and the south-facing window and 3 children who said what they meant and meant what they said, was a life that was entirely its own. It did not look like what people had expected, back in the days when the widows and the schoolteacher and the banker's daughter had each tried and retreated. It did not look like a managed life or a polished life or a socially convenient life. It looked like exactly what it was, which was 2 people in full possession of themselves, choosing each other with complete awareness, building something real on ground that was already honest. In the fall of 1896, when the county fair came to the field south of Millard Creek as it did every October, the Whitaker family came in together. Reuben, who had never attended the county fair in the years of his bachelorhood, had begun attending it with Jennie in 1880 because she liked it, and had discovered over subsequent years that he did not dislike it as much as he had assumed he would, mostly because walking through it with Jennie meant a running exchange of observation and opinion that was, frankly, more entertaining than most things. Samuel, now 16, walked ahead with a group of his own contemporaries. May, at 13, was deeply interested in the livestock section and had already pulled her father toward the cattle exhibit with the specific intent of assessing a particular breed comparison she had been thinking about. Thomas, at 7, wanted to be everywhere at once and was executing this ambition with characteristic determination. Reuben and Jennie followed their children through the fair in the October afternoon, and the light was the particular amber light of a Kansas fall, and the smell was dried corn and wood smoke, and the particular dusty sweetness of fair food. And around them the county moved and talked and laughed in the way that people do when they are permitted to simply be themselves for an afternoon. Clara Higgins found them near the baking competition and said to Jennie, in a voice that was meant to carry, "I want you to know that I said back in 1878 that I did not understand what you were doing with that man, and I was wrong, and I have been wrong every year since, and I am now old enough to admit it openly." Jennie said, "You were not wrong. You were working with incomplete information." Clara looked at her. What information was missing? "That I was not doing anything with him," Jennie said. "I was just talking to him." Clara thought about this for a moment. "Is that all it was?" Reuben, who had been standing beside Jennie and who had heard all of this, said, with his characteristic directness, "That is all it ever needed to be." Clara looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face settled, and she said, "Well, I suppose that is the simplest possible answer, and I should have thought of it years ago." "Most people should," Reuben said. He said it without edge, simply as an observation. They moved on through the fair, and Thomas found the pie competition and required management, and May conducted what amounted to a professional-level critique of the cattle exhibition, and Samuel returned from his contemporaries long enough to say something about a horse race being set up at the south end of the field, and Reuben listened to this with the expression of a man making a quiet assessment, and said to Jennie quietly, "Do you want to see the horse race?" "Yes," she said. "Obviously." "Then we are going to see the horse race," he said, and took her arm, and they went. The evening came down over the county fair field with the warm slowness of an October sunset, all red and amber, and the particular quality of light that the Kansas plain reserved for its best moments. And the Whitaker family found each other again at the wagon as the day ended, the children tired and full and still animated by the events of the afternoon, and they drove home through the October dark, with the stars coming out over the plain and the road smooth under the wheels and the horses steady. Reuben drove and Jennie sat beside him with Thomas asleep against her side, and the two older children were quiet in the back, and the ranch came into view with the lamp in the south window lit, because Dally, who had stayed behind to check the new section fence, had lit it on his way out as he sometimes did. The yellow light in the south window was the same as it always was, and the plain was dark around it, and the stars were everywhere above, and Reuben looked at his wife in the lamplight as they pulled into the yard, and she looked back at him, and they were exactly what they had always been, two people who had found in each other the specific and irreplaceable thing that cannot be achieved by managing someone into a better version of themselves, but only by standing in front of who they actually are and saying, without hesitation, yes. The ranch ran on through the years the same way the creek ran, steadily, with purpose, with the particular richness of water that has found its course and does not need to be redirected. Samuel eventually worked the land beside his father with the partnership of two people who know the same ground and have no argument about its value. May, at 20, was writing articles about sustainable ranching and land management for a Kansas agricultural journal, which made Reuben quietly and inexpressibly proud, and which he expressed by ordering her another shelf of books without comment. Thomas grew into the most sociable of the three, with his mother's genuine interest in people and his father's absolute inability to pretend about things, which made him, in the county's collective opinion, very good company and occasionally very uncomfortable to be around. Jennie's bookkeeping practice continued through the county's growth years, and she had trained a younger woman, a minister's daughter named Helen Carr, who had the same aptitude and the same straight honesty, to take on part of the workload, and between them, they kept the accounts of most of the significant ranching operations in the county in the clear, honest order that allowed the ranchers to actually understand what they were building. Reuben, at 60, had the same dark eyes and the same direct mouth and the same complete indifference to the social pressure that had tried, at various points across 3 decades, to smooth him into something easier to manage. He was still the most stubborn man in the county. He had outlasted every attempt to change that, not through resistance exactly, but through the more powerful mechanism of simply being so thoroughly himself that there was no available surface for alteration to grip. And he was, by any honest account, one of the most beloved figures in the county, not in spite of this, but because of it, because people knew that when Reuben Whitaker said a thing, the thing was true, and when he made a commitment, it held, and when he looked at you with those dark, direct eyes, what you were getting was the full, honest weight of his attention, without performance, without management, without anything between his view of the world and the words he used to describe it. Jennie was 53, still with the auburn hair that had gone streaked with silver in her 40s and was now more silver than red, and still with the green eyes that had the same quality they had always had, that genuinely interested attention that took things as they were. She had become, in the county, the person people went to when they needed to think clearly about a problem, not because she always had the answer, but because she had the quality of making you see the actual problem, instead of the frightening version of it that panic produced. She was still most herself, though in the evenings at the ranch, at the south-facing window, with the ledger or the book in the lamplight and Reuben in the chair across from her, and the sound of their children's lives moving through the house around them, and the plane dark and enormous outside the glass, and the creek running somewhere in the darkness, over the rocks that had been there for longer than the human memory of this place, and the grass holding the roots in the soil, and the cattle somewhere in the dark pastures breathing the cool night air, and everything exactly as it had grown to be. On an evening in October of 1898, exactly 20 years after Reuben had first walked into Harold Fenwick's store and found someone who was not Harold Fenwick running the column of figures in the ledger, they sat together in the south room after the supper was cleared, and the children were in their own pursuits, and the lamp was lit between them, and the plain was dark outside. Reuben was reading a report on the water table levels in the county that the new Kansas state geologist had published, because there was a section of it that applied directly to the east pasture, and he wanted to understand it fully. Jennie was writing a letter to her brother in Missouri, whose wife had fully recovered from her illness of 20 years ago, and whose children were grown, and who lived a steady and good life now, in part because of a money transfer that had been made possible by a man who had offered a practical solution on a porch step in the summer of 1878. Jennie paused in the letter and looked up, and found Reuben looking at her from across the table, not with the assessment expression she had first known him by, but with the other expression, the one that had taken years to come fully to the surface, that said she was the person in all the world he was most glad to be in the same room with. "What?" She said. "Nothing," he said. "I am just looking at you," she smiled. "After 20 years you would think you had seen enough. After 20 years," he said, "I find I have not." She went back to the letter, and he went back to the report, and the lamp burned between them, and the plane was outside the window in the October dark, and the Whitaker ranch was all around them, every acre of it honest and well-made and real, and the most stubborn man in the county sat across the table from the only person who had ever simply let him be, and the world was exactly what it should have been. The years that followed continued in the same steady, purposeful manner that had characterized everything the Whitakers had built. Samuel married a thoughtful young woman named Clara in 1901, a rancher's daughter from the north of the county who had her own clear opinions and no interest in being managed, which Reuben assessed in their first meeting with obvious approval. May, at 18, continued her writing and had begun corresponding with a professor at the Kansas Agricultural College, who had read her articles and recognized in them a quality of observation that warranted serious academic encouragement. Thomas, at 16, had the run of the county on his father's horse and was developing, under the influence of both parents and of living in a household where honesty was the primary value, into a person of remarkable character. The Whitaker ranch stood on its 460 acres like something that had been grown rather than built, rooted into the Kansas plain with the same deep and honest certainty as the creek that ran through the east section, and the grass that held the soil against the wind, and the man who had known this land for 3 decades and had never, in all that time, pretended to be anything other than what he was, which was everything. Which, as Jennie Leland Whitaker had known from the beginning, standing on the porch of Fenwick's General Store with a letter in her lap and a cup of coffee going cool in her hand, looking at a man who looked straight back at her with no performance and no apology and nothing between them, but the full, honest weight of a human being meeting another human being in the clear light of a Kansas summer morning was more than enough. It was everything that had ever needed to be.